I'm Ron Vidal. We're live at Oppenheimer & Company's headquarters, 300 Madison in Midtown, New York. And with me for this segment is Tim Horan, who's the Telecom Services and Internet Infrastructure Analyst at Oppenheimer, and Keith Mallinson, who's the founder of Wise Harbor. And today's topic is we're going to start off with what's going on in the mobile operators' business models. What's happening out there? We've seen incredible uptake in unit demand. What's going on in pricing? Are these sustainable? What are the challenges that network operators face and people that are both upstream and downstream in their supply chain? And then what's next on the roadmap? So with that, I'll toss it over to Tim and then to Keith just to describe a bit about what you do at your firm, and we'll get our discussion rolling.
Thanks. I'm an equity stock analyst. Basically, I follow the entire services food chain, wireless, wireline, cable, internet infrastructure. So it gives me a fairly good perspective on what is going on in the industry. I think as the former panel kind of talked about, everything's moving to IP. You're separating the applications from the underlying network, and this is a once-in-a-generation or once-a-century probably shift in how we're architecting the networks and how the industry is going to be structured. We believe the proper structure for the industry is much more of a horizontally segmented one as we move to this IP world which is really enabling cloud computing and video over IP and voice over IP. And we believe the most successful companies longer term are going to be ones that align with this horizontal structure, either wholesale-focused companies like the towers, consumer-focused companies like Apple, or more enterprise-focused companies, which right now are really still a lot more controlled by the incumbent communications industry. We do think the best way to make money longer term, and we'll talk about the models, are companies that control within this the either unique infrastructure or unique applications. They are somewhat difficult to find. Clearly, towers are very unique infrastructure. Some data centers are quite unique, and it's really all tied together. On the applications front, we'll see how things play out here, but clearly Apple's in a very, very strong position, and the next panelists will end up talking about that a little bit. But to us, really, Apple is becoming a consumer-focused communications company and doing a much better job at it, frankly, than the wireless companies are right now.
Good morning. I'm Keith Mallinson from Wise Harbor. I'm a long-standing industry analyst. I've been doing that kind of work for a long, long time. But at Wise Harbor, mainly doing consulting work. I also write a couple of columns for a couple of industry publications. And everything I do is related to the cellular industry these days. What I do is mainly commercial kind of work within the sector. A couple of perspectives. I think one of the most striking things for me in the mobile world is that I think we're on the brink of a major revolution in terms of mobile broadband. So if you think of what's been achieved globally with cellular, it's really been quite surprising how far mobile telephony has diffused. So 4 or 5 billion connections worldwide. Even a decade ago, people really didn't foresee that kind of level of penetration worldwide.
Maybe Chris did.
And it's come about as a result of phones now. You can get them for $20. And so pretty much everybody has access to a phone worldwide. Or a very large proportion. What we're going to see over the next 10, 15 years is a kind of repeat of that kind of phenomenon, but for data. So I think it's really exciting times. But it is actually quite a big disruption to the industry in terms of the way the networks are built, in terms of the way the services are delivered, and most importantly, and it plays to this panel we're discussing here, is in terms of the business models. And that relates not just to the developed countries, but to the developing countries as well, because in particular in the developing countries, the mobile device is going to be the primary means of internet connection. In fact, for many people, it will be their only method of connecting to the internet.
So let's pick that up for a second, which is the business models around cellular have historically been around voice and with the attachment of a data plan to it. How do you see that changing? And is voice going to be, if I look at my bill today from my carrier, I get all this call detail record off it. It's like pages and pages and pages. Normally it says mobile to mobile 0, mobile to mobile 0, anytime, whatever. And data is like one line, data plan, or international text line. But are we going to start seeing, or are we already start seeing, the voice is the diminishing app. It's getting subsumed. It's a big chunk of the cost structure, but it's not where the future demand is relative to capacity in networks and pricing in networks.
The application voice is not going to go away, but its economic significance is going to change dramatically. Historically, it has been the cash cow on mobile networks, and for the time being, that's going to continue, but it's going to decline, and it will ultimately just be one among a variety of applications that are carried over the networks. And the way pricing is occurring, certainly there's a development more sophisticated, more complex, more discriminate pricing for data services. I think the voice application just ends up being one among many services. And in a way, there's a bit of an echo of what happened on the fixed networks from a decade ago. Voice was the big cash cow. Voice has gone into decline with competition, with substitution effects, for example, internet telephony services such as Skype that are running over data services. And really, I guess the salvation for the telcos was that they inherited through DSL service, if you like, the fixed broadband services. So we're going to see something of a kind of repeat of this kind of phenomenon occurring on the mobile networks. And just finally, already for some operators in some geographies, movement has gone quite a long way. So, for example, SoftBank in Japan already has more revenues derived from data than it does from voice.
So I started off that conversation with this kind of broad brush, but really, to drill down, we need to drill down into each individual operator and the countries in which they operate, because regimes are all different, and their 3G deployments may be faster or slower than others, handsets may be lagging or leading, etc. So give me a flavor for what do we see happening. The Japan data point, or SoftBank data point, is an interesting one, because it sounds like maybe revenue is following demand, as opposed to where still a significant portion of a U.S. wireless bill is still in voice, and I buy your thesis that it's declining. What's it going to?
It's certainly saturating at any rate. It depends on the geography, but there is a saturation effect on the traditional voice services, and that's occurring certainly in all the developed countries.
So is the model? There's lots of experimentation that I could see in the marketplace today, which is initially in the States it was kind of all you can eat unlimited data, and which is like the economics of running a smorgasbord, right? You're hoping that the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders come through as opposed to the Dallas Cowboys, right, for lunch, because they're going to eat a little bit and pay the same amount as opposed to eating a lot and pay the same amount. But these unlimited plans are now turning out to be the thing that's driving capital expenditures and platform upgrades. We didn't really need to go from 2G to 3G to get better voice, and we certainly don't need to go to 4G to get better voice. The purists might say, well, we could get stereo voice. Yeah, great. But the point is, where do you see data plan pricing going?
Well, I think you have to look at the carriers' motives and what they're looking to see, and I think they're looking to see ARPU growth and lower churn with higher margins. And if you look at how the iPhone's packaged, it's really priced so that you get a minimum of $90 a month for AT&T's perspective.
Right.
So you have to take a certain package of voice and a certain package of data. And they're going to continue to have price points out there that whatever happens, grow the ARPU. Because in the United States, and every market's somewhat different, but in the United States we're basically hitting saturation of subscriber growth. So they want to start to see ARPU growth grow 3, 4, 5% per year. A lot of different ways to do that. The wireline's a fairly good model because now we have a triple play in the United States for $100, and you have a whole bunch of value-added services on there to get you up to $150, and that continues to grow every year despite all the changes in technology. I think the carriers now, to your point, you'll get a certain minimum package of data, and every gigabit more above that, 2 or 3 gigabits or whatever you're buying, it'll be $10 a month to try to grow that 4 or 5% ARPU per year. I know Verizon full well believes with the LTE networks that they're rolling out that the average usage is going to grow substantially. The average wireline usage right now is about 5 gigabits a month in the United States. High-end smartphones are really only about a half a gigabit. So just growing from that half a gigabit up to 5 gigabit, that tenfold growth, which I think we'll see in the next 3 to 4 years, is going to drive the overall ARPUs. And you're not going to be able to get these high-end phones without paying a minimum $70, $80 a month, then plus the usage on top of that. But that's going to driven, every market's going to be different. In the United States, we're kind of concentrating down to really a duopoly player. You can maybe argue it's an oligopoly, but those two players have huge pricing power and a very, very high quality network with the high-end customers on family plans. So the U.S. is a very unique market.
So does that then change the game into make sure we reduce churn? Because that's because usually in these mature markets, when you get into a duopoly situation, then it turns into a churn reduction game. How do I lose least amount of customers as opposed to, so I don't have to go through the client acquisition expense to replace them. Is that part of it? And then what are you seeing outside the States, Keith, relative to like how ARPU expansion?
Well, again, it depends on geography, but in Europe, the market's pretty brutal in the traditional business because there are typically, most of the major markets like the UK and Germany, there are 4 or 5 players even. There's not as much consolidation occurring. There's more network sharing and some of these kinds of arrangements. So it's quite tough from the competitive point of view. There are also some regulatory measures that on call termination charges and roaming, international roaming, which is much more significant in Europe than it is for American subscribers. These are putting quite a lot of revenue pressure on the carriers, and the carriers are in a, let's say, slightly more advanced state than the United States in terms of market saturation for a whole variety of historical reasons. So I think it's tougher in many respects, and in a way they're more desperate to be able to get some revenue and margin growth through data, just in terms of data, you made the point about the flat rate pricing, the smorgasbord approach. I think that actually worked quite well initially when no one was using it.
Right.
And that was literally the problem. When 3G started,
right,
it was it was a disappointment because no one really used it much for anything else other than voice. And actually, it did actually help the carriers with voice capacity. It became a capacity play, but the phones didn't really offer much. They were
clunky,
big and clunky.
Browsers didn't really work.
And they had to, in fact, they had to put more subsidy into those to get people to be willing to take them. But then it all changed around about 2007, 2008, when people started doing this data. And then that created a new problem, which is actually the nice problem, the one that we have to fix now, which is how do we manage this traffic growth and how do we monetize it? So they're switching out of the flat rate all-you-can-eat plans. And yes, it will move from that being that one line on your bill to something maybe more complicated, more sophisticated. All sorts of things are possible. And at the moment, I think the market's in a kind of experimentation phase. So they're doing things like they're throttling when you hit a cap, or they cut you off, or you pay overage. There may be an opportunity, if the network neutrality police allow you to do it, to have some more content-based charging and some clever tricks and things. Over time, it's going to be much more sophisticated on the data side.
Laurent, you're specifically on your question. I mean, what investors really, the 3 metrics we really focus on are ARPU, churn, which is critical, and then cost per gross add or handset subsidies. And all you want to see improvements on all 3 of them. ARPU has been fairly decent in the United States the last couple of years. Churn continues to trend down for a variety of reasons. Handset subsidies, though, has been a little bit of a killer last few years, a large part because of the iPhone has a $400 plus subsidy. That's pressured AT&T's margins quite a bit. So that balance of power was
been great for Apple's margins.
Been great for Apple, and it's been great for the overall growth in the for sure of the market. But at the same time, the service providers have not been able to share in the applications revenue, and that was part of the plan kind of 5-6 years ago. So I think that's surprised them quite a bit, and it's hard to see how that really changes. You might be able to, I know in Europe they're pushing very much for regulatory relief to be able to get paid for usage from the content providers. Europe, they might have a little bit more luck at that. In the United States, we'll see.
It seems to me there's this interesting convergence of devices, networks, content, either copyrighted or user-generated. People right now, I think you're right on the experimentation stage, because people are making, in essence, uneconomic choices, or choices that have no economic penalty or reward. Hi, I'm going to download that YouTube stream because I can. It's in my data plan, why not? Causes huge strain down the line in the operator's network, especially when the law of large numbers, the new Lady Gaga thing comes out, and everybody's hitting the YouTube button at the same time. All of a sudden, it's like, oh my God, we can't get any traffic through. And so this period of experimentation that we're going through right now, it sounds like, on the one hand, to Tim's point, protect ARPU, decrease churn, and decrease handset subsidies. So in other words, that's the installed base of business. Keep that going. That's what keeps the company's valuation in play. That's what the bondholders look to for assurances on the future of the business. On the other side, the big traffic growth is happening over here, which is the pricing is data pricing is a contributor to ARPU, maybe a churn reduction or churn acceleration mechanism. Same for handset subsidies. So, is this a case where the operators, and once again, it's difficult to generalize all operators, but some operators may be playing defense and trying to manage a soft landing on this as they move over to data, or that they're testing a lot of data points out there to see what's actually going to work without causing decrease in ARPU, increase in churn, and rotation off handsets?
I think you've got the revenue effects, but you've also got the cost side of the equation as well. So we've got escalating traffic growth. It's doubling every year. And my view of Wise Harbor is that it's going to continue to double every year, probably for the rest of the decade. So that compounds out to be...
It's a big number.
Very big. Maybe could be 1,000-fold traffic growth in a decade. As we move from a world which is almost exclusively about voice,
right,
to one where voice is just a very small piece of the overall data demand. So then what becomes crucially important is the cost structure. And initially the cost of the data transport didn't matter too much because people weren't using it.
Right.
It didn't matter that you were using backhauling with T1s.
So what?
Because if you got one or two T1s to a site and you've got a bit of data going on there, so what? So one of those is being used by data. But that was what was going on in the mid-2000s, just to try to get people to use some of this data stuff. They'd invested in the network, the 3G capability. Let's get them to use it. So they did. So now has to be the rethink of the networks in terms of being efficient, cost-effective in terms of that network resource. Understanding what the profitability is in terms of traffic. Getting to the point where you actually want to encourage people to use more rather than discourage them. Remember that old simple marketing economic principle? And when you move to more of a kind of variable pricing approach, you get to that point where you can get marginal contribution by getting people to use more. But you better understand what your cost structure is, and you better have that tracking downwards, because pricing is probably going to be moving in the downward direction as well. So those are the important things, and that's where I talk about experimentation.
Right.
It's a bit on the pricing side. There's also an exploration going on to try to understand what the forward-looking cost structure is going to be, and that's certainly one of the things I'm looking at the moment in terms of deferring CapEx, minimizing the OpEx, what kind of new architectures, what new technologies are going to, and this includes the radio, the backhaul, also traffic management, policy, and all these good things to really be optimal in terms of the economics and the profitability.
Well, just listening to this conversation, it just sounds to me like everything's on the table, right? Revenue and all the elements of revenue, cost, both capital and operating expenses, and looking down every line item. I mean, if you're a network operator, whether you're in the CFO's office or the CTO's office or the chief marketing officer's office. You'd have to be thinking in that way.
It's got to be transformational. I'll give you an international example. So Yota in Russia is a 4G only, if you like, operate broadband only. So they're deploying LTE. They're not going to have a voice network. So they don't have the voice legacy, and they're optimizing the network so a service such as Skype can travel over it. Okay, but that will just be riding for free. You know, it's an over-the-top service
Right.
that will ride on their network. You got that greenfield, if you like, disruptive architecture and business model to compete with. You better be careful if you've got your head looking backwards at the way you did things in the days when it was all about voice. And this kind of transformation, I think, is as applicable in the United States, in Western Europe, in other developed countries, because this change will be coming about over the next 5
Keith,
years.
to see a 1,000-fold increase in traffic, and I don't disagree with you, that is an incredible sea change in how we network these, architect these networks. So there's no way you can handle it on the existing network architecture. What do you think has to happen to be able to handle this type of traffic? Obviously, you're studying this stuff fairly closely.
In terms of accommodating additional traffic, the variables you've really got are improving the spectral efficiency. So we have this Shannon's law limit that
Right.
The technologists pursue, and we're kind of getting close to as far as we can go. Well, let's say it's diminishing returns and what can be done on that. So maybe we get an uplift of a factor of 2 or 3 or 4 or something like that.
When we're looking for 1,000.
Doesn't take us very far, does it? Okay, so the next thing is spectrum. Okay, there's a lot of lobbying, a lot of pressure to get hundreds of megabits more, megahertz more radio spectrum available for cellular networks. Okay, so that could give us a factor of 5 or 10 or something like that if we're really lucky. That
Right.
still doesn't take us far
Probably
enough.
more like 2 or 3, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
So
so
Well, you know,
Yeah.
it all depends on if you go very, very high frequencies. Then you get more. You get you get more the higher the band you go to. So if you go to literally 80 gigahertz or something like that, you get more capacity there. But it's very limited.
And then the
in
base
terms of-
stations are this
Yeah,
wide,
and
like
it's
literally
lines-
this wide.
they're highly line of sight and all this kind
Right.
of thing. But I absolutely agree with your general point. So there's one other thing you can do, and that is increase the number of cells. And we're
Dramatically.
already doing that, and that is going to be the main way that this capacity increase is achieved. We do it already. Wi-Fi is turning out to be a great method for offload.
Definitely.
Those are very small cells. You get a lot of capacity there. It's great for the carriers because it's unlicensed, has some other issues, but that's part of it. But also the femtocells, the pico, and what they call hetronets, where it's a kind of combination of all these things. Distributed antenna systems, as we heard earlier. All told, effectively the number of sites, big and small, is going to increase quite dramatically. That is where most of the capacity increase is going to
So
be.
it sounds like that has to be like a 10 to 100-fold increase in the number of sites, or 50-fold increase
To
in
be
the number
able
of
to
sites.
give that kind of capacity gain, yes.
And what percentage of them do you think will be on towers versus distributed, like in buildings or at customer premises?
I think the towers, the big towers that we see as we drive along the highways, are really mainly about coverage, and they're going to continue to be mainly about coverage. They will have more capacity, but increasingly the sites are going to be smaller, they're going to be lower, and
Yep.
they're going to be providing capacity particularly in urban and these kinds of areas. In the rural areas, actually, interestingly, you've still got effectively the same amount of spectrum. Capacity isn't going to be so much of a problem.
Right.
And that's actually very good news, I think, for providing broadband capability to people in more remote locations in the United States, which is a big country.
Sure.
Where there's a lot of sparsely populated areas, but also in a lot of developing regions around the world where there is
No
very
other
little
infrastructure.
there is no
Right.
fixed infrastructure apart from perhaps in the very dense urban areas.
And do you think, Powerwave was talking about the CTO keeping up the existing 3G networks for quite a long period of time, but Verizon at the CTIA said that they're going to start the transition and shutting down 3G for voice and transitioning voice onto LTE starting next summer to free up spectrum. It seems to me to be hard to do from a handset perspective, and might make some sense in really urban areas where you really absolutely need the spectrum. But have you studied this much?
It is something I study because one of the things I do is forecast. And I'm, unlike most of the industry analysts, I put my neck over the parapet and actually forecast out not just 5 years like they do, but 10 years. For business modeling purposes, you kind of need to do that.
Sure.
Somebody's got to do it.
Somebody's got to do it.
So that's one of the things I do. And I do think that these technologies will stick around. GSM, 2G is going to be around for a long time.
Sure.
Because it's the lowest common denominator for roaming. And the one thing, and it's easy.
Oh, right, sure, of course.
Piece
And
of
SMS.
technology, you keep it within the phone for SMS and
Sure.
for voice.
Sure.
But there may be just, you want a phone that enables you to go to some African republic that hasn't got round to upgrading for whatever reasons, and you want that capability to roam onto that. So there will be that capability that stays around. In terms of, if you looked at the number of minutes, the total 100% of minutes, what proportion of them go over to LTE off 3G and whatever, and how quickly, I think it takes a while. I think there may be a bit of that. Verizon may have particular reasons for wanting to do it sooner than most. But we've got a way to go in terms of the migration to LTE voice. Meanwhile, we have a very robust, very proven, and actually quite cost-effective solution with our 3G voice. That actually is a solution that works very well. So I think we're going to continue to use a lot of that for a long time.
As I listen to all of this whole panel discussion today, this is number 3 of our 4 in our series today. It just strikes me that we have a system that's around the world that operates pretty well. There's been literally a step function in demand created by companies beyond the control of the network operators, but that have reasons to connect to them. Disruptions in the traffic models cause disruptions in the revenue models, cause disruption in capital spending, which causes disruption in architecture and network operations and all these things. And it just struck me that everything's on the table at a time when, driven by demand, driven by everything that wireless networks ever really wanted to do was to connect people without a cord. As I like to say, wireless means less wire, not no wire. And so you gave people mobility, and you're giving them processing power, and you're giving them memory, and you're giving them applications, and this is kind of what you get. And it's all on the table at a time when the industry has a fundamental rethink in front of it. Things are working now, but you're starting to see stress cracks.
They were out of time. That was quick.
But anyway, so I want to thank Tim and Keith. It was very insightful. Appreciate you guys coming down today. And look to see you again.
Thanks, Ron. Thank you. Excellent.